So our final talk, last but not least, Charlotte Winder has been waiting for a while. She's from the University of Guelph, and she's going to talk to us about back to disbudding and dehorning again, and it's a survey of veterinarians and dairy producers in Ontario. Thanks, Charlotte.
Great, thank you. So I'll be presenting some results from work that we've done looking at the practices for disbudding and dehorning of dairy calves by both dairy producers and veterinarians in Ontario, Canada. So just a brief background. While disbudding, of course, refers to removal or destruction of the horn bud prior to attachment of the horn to the base of the skull, and dehorning is removal after this time. Just for simplicity, I'm just going to use the term dehorning to encompass both practices for this presentation. So generally, this is done by one of three methods, either causing a thermal burn, a chemical burn, or surgical amputation. And it's well established that all methods are painful when they're done without appropriate analgesics. So in general, best practices would involve the use of local anesthetic, commonly given as a corneal nerve block, as well as an NSAID. And sedation can be given as well to reduce handling stress. So it's important from several different perspectives that we use appropriate pain control. Clearly it's important to the welfare of the calf, but it's also important for the dairy industry as a whole. And there's been some really good work done showing that industry stakeholders view painful procedures as being key welfare issues in the dairy industry. And work done surveying consumers shows that they are aware of painful, or becoming increasingly aware of painful procedures on farm. So dehorning is still very common on most dairies for the safety of other animals as well as the people who work with them. And in North America, the majority of dehorning would be done on farm either by the producer or farm staff, with the remainder done perhaps by a veterinarian or veterinary technician. In North America, cautery remains the most commonly used method. And reported use of pain control by dairy producers in North America ranges from 15 to 40%. These studies have been done in different geographic regions throughout North America over the last decade. It appears that it may be increasing over time, but again, these were in different geographic regions, one of which was done by the research group at the University of Guelph in 2004, which I'll allude to further. So a little more into the Canadian industry. All three categories of medications in Canada are only available through veterinarians. And while there's no requirement for the use of pain control currently, there is a voluntary code of practice which recommends the use of all three types of medication, as well as dehorning at a young age. However, there will be a program coming up soon that does have a requirement for the use of pain control for dehorning. It requires documentation as well, and this is a mandatory program for all farms in Canada, and it will be rolling out, the animal care portion of which rolls out in 2017. So with this in mind, the objective of our study was to describe current disbudding and dehorning practices. We wanted to see as well if practices had changed over the past decade, and if they had, what reported reasons existed, as well as if we could identify factors associated with adoption of best practices. And we hypothesized that perhaps improvements have been made over the past 10 years. So we launched 2 surveys in November of 2014 that closed in February of 2015. They were hosted online with a telephone option. Our source population for dairy producers came from a random subset of all licensed dairy producers in the province, stratified by 15 geographic zones and weighted by population within the zone. Our veterinarian source population came from all current practicing members of the Ontario Association of Bovine Practitioners. So our survey included several sections which were similar for both veterinarians and dairy producers, including demographics, dehorning practices, knowledge of the code of practice, and their perceptions of painful procedures. We also included 2 sections for producers on calf management and the use of polled sires. So for this presentation, I'm just going to focus on the dehorning practices and the pain perception areas. So briefly, we had a 27% response rate from the producers and 39% from veterinarians. Interestingly, contact information was voluntary for this survey. You only had to provide it if you wanted to win a draw prize. But no dairy producers chose to be anonymous, and we had 3 veterinarians choose to be anonymous. We could track people throughout the survey, and we defined a dropout as someone who opened the first web page and did not complete the last page, and we didn't have anyone that dropped out. So our first question was, who's performing dehorning on your farm? And 27% of our dairy producers' respondents said that they used a veterinarian for dehorning, and this correlated very well with our veterinary survey, where veterinarians estimated they performed dehorning for a mean of 29% of their clients. Looking into the age at which they perform dehorning at, you can see it's somewhat evenly split between the three age categories, with veterinarians performing more of their dehornings at an earlier age as compared to producers. Looking at method, cautery was the most commonly selected method for most of the dehorning, followed by surgical amputation for vets and chemical and surgical methods for dairy producers. Looking at the use of medication, 62% of dairy producers reported using local anesthetic, 38% using sedation, and about a quarter using an NSAID. We had almost all vets, but not all, say they used a local anesthetic, 62% using sedation, and almost half using an NSAID. So we explored a little further as to why people either chose to use or not use a particular medication. So they were given a long list of reasons. They could select none, all, and there was an other category where they could write something in. So I'm just going to show the top 3 reasons that each population chose either to use or not use each medication. So for local anesthetic, dairy producers most commonly cited concern for pain control, ease of handling, and safety. And you can see it's fairly similar for why veterinarians chose to use local anesthetic. For those that did not use local anesthetic, the most commonly cited reason was that they were unaware of this drug, followed by that it was too timely or too cost-consuming. And you can see, too, that there are a lot of non-users that chose not to provide a reason. And the veterinary non-responders, again, only represent 3% of that population. So looking at sedation, top reasons for dairy producers choosing to use this drug were ease of handling. Interestingly, 86% thought that their sedative provided pain control, and 75% thought it made the procedure safer. Veterinarians chose ease of handling, safety, and lack of a cost barrier. Looking at those who did not use sedation, again, the dairy producers said they were not aware of this drug, that it was not necessary for handling or not necessary for pain control. Veterinarians who didn't use sedation said it was not necessary for handling, perhaps that the owner requested that they not use this drug, or that it was not needed for pain control. And finally, our NSAIDs. Again, the top 3 reasons for use were the same for veterinarians and producers: concern for pain control, that it was available to them, and that they considered it not to be a high cost. Looking at those who did not use an NSAID, again, we see dairy producers saying they are not aware of this drug. 10% said it was perhaps too expensive, and 10% said they didn't need this drug for pain control. Where 92% of vets who didn't use an NSAID said they felt it was too expensive, that the producer wouldn't pay for it when they used it. 50% said it was owner request other than cost, and 18% of vets thought that NSAIDs were not necessary for pain control. And I think it's interesting here that these are 2 different populations, but because these are producers who do their own dehorning versus vets who do dehorning for producers, but there's quite a difference there in the perceived cost of NSAIDs. And just for reference, in Canada, of course, it's going to depend on what NSAID you choose and the size of the animal, but for a 4-week-old calf with a product in Canada that's labeled for use after disbudding, maybe around $2 a calf. Before I was discussing that, there was a survey done by the group at the University of Guelph in 2004, and it was published in 2007. And just to compare the results there, they were drawn from the same Ontario population, but it was not a longitudinal study, so we'll just compare the numbers numerically. You can see there is quite a difference in the numbers of dairy producers reporting use of those 3 medication categories compared to the survey done in 2004. And an increase in the number of veterinarians saying they're using an NSAID for dehorning compared with 2004. So we also asked in the current survey if for veterinarians who had been practicing more than 10 years and for dairy producers, had you changed your practices in the last 10 years? And 2/3 of dairy producers said they had, and 3/4 of vets said they had. And this could have been more than just the adoption of pain control. It could have also included dehorning animals at a younger age. Dairy producers who had changed their practices were asked who or what may have influenced them to change their practices, and they could have selected any or all of the given who or what categories, but you can see that their veterinarian was most commonly cited as being influential. So we'll just move briefly into another section of the survey, and this was on perceptions of pain. It was similar for both groups, so they were given 8 different procedures or conditions that may occur in cattle and asked how painful they thought they were. We used a Likert scale from 0 being not painful at all to 10 being the worst pain imaginable. And they were asked to imagine that these procedures or conditions occurred without the use of any pain control, with the exception of the LDA surgery, where we said the cow received a local block. So I'll just show you the results from the 3 dehorning categories that we used. So here you can see the distribution of the Likert scores. I don't know if it's so easy, sorry for my choice of colors. The solid gray bars are dairy producers and the percentage of respondents selecting that number, and the crosshatch bars are the percentage of veterinary respondents choosing that number. And when we looked at the equality of distribution between the 2 survey populations for one particular category, there was no significant difference. So perhaps if you can't see the differences in the bars, it doesn't matter. It's very similar for the 2 populations. So you can see for surgical amputation at 5 months of age, it's a very tight distribution with a high mean score. The perceived pain of cautery at 2 weeks has a wider distribution compared with surgical amputation with a slightly lower mean score. And you can see the perceived pain of chemical disbudding was quite wide, it had the largest standard deviation of any of the 8 procedures or conditions. So just to wrap up, based on our results, we feel that there has been improvement in the use of pain control in this population over the past decade. We saw the primary drivers for the use of different medications to be animal-centered. From our Likert scoring, we think that as a population, dairy producers and veterinarians appear to view pain in cattle quite similarly. However, we did identify the potential disconnect between perceived costs of NSAIDs. That said, dairy producers did very commonly cite their herd veterinarian as being highly influential in changing their dehorning practices. And we hope that veterinarians recognize and perhaps leverage their role as leaders in pain control to help further push for positive industry change. So with that, I would like to acknowledge my co-authors, as well as the survey participants, the collaboration we received from the DFO and the OABP, as well as our funding sources. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Charlotte. Nice take-home message there for all the vets in the audience. Has anyone got a question for Charlotte? Laura.
Shall I shout?
He's coming.
Laura Hanne, University of Helsinki. Thank you. It was a very interesting talk. I just wonder, because we conducted sort of a similar study in Finland a couple of years ago, and our figures were sort of similar in the sense that the cattle producers, we did that for dairy and beef, and veterinarians, they seem to evaluate the pain in a similar way. But in Finland, the vets and cattle producers, they evaluated that the disbudding pain was a lot more severe than what your study showed. On the other hand, I mean, almost over half of the farmers are using veterinarian already to medicate their calf. So could it be just, I don't know, lack of awareness, or how would you, what has changed in Canada that you get now better figures than you get 10 years ago? And what do you think what you should do to get them even better? Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I think increased awareness on the part of veterinarians, perhaps, more continuing education on awareness of pain control options. I think also the primary, I think it was over 80% of the use of NSAIDs was meloxicam, and in Canada that has a label for use after disbudding, and that was only, I believe, released in 2009, and I don't have information, but it was very commonly cited, and Personally, I think some of the marketing there perhaps helped too. But yeah, I think continuing education efforts, hopefully, and more awareness on behalf of both producers and veterinarians. But yeah, it's interesting going forward because I don't know if the people who are no longer using or who aren't using pain control, if they're necessarily the same as the people who have adopted pain control. So it might be different efforts needed there. And the one thing I think that's interesting is, and I didn't have time to present it, but in the 2004 survey, the reasons that people chose not to use pain control were different, and less people said they were unaware. So although it might not be true that they're unaware, I think they're more cognizant that time and cost are no longer appropriate reasons to say it's not good. But thank you. Sorry.
Thanks, Henry. Fine. Okay, I think, is there another question? No? Well then, I'd just like to thank all the speakers for a very interesting session and to thank all of you for participating. Thank you.